Good evening and welcome to the January 2nd, 2024 regular meeting of the Tredyffrin Easttown School Board. We'll begin as always with a salute to the flag. Welcome, everyone. Regular school board meetings are business meetings that are open to the public, during which we provide several opportunities for public comment on items before the board. The first comment period is reserved for announced additional agenda items and items on the consent agenda only. Comments will be received after each priority discussion item prior to the vote on those items. And there's a final comment period near the end of the meeting, which is reserved for all other matters of concern, official action, or deliberation, which are or may be before the TESD Board of Directors and which are not covered by the other comment periods. Each public comment period is reserved for residents and taxpayers. Additionally, the board will accept comments from sitting public officials for non-campaigning purposes, and by agreement with the TEA and TENIG, the board will accept comments from the union presidents. All comments should be directed to the board as a whole or to the presiding officer, me. No comments or questions should be directed to individual board members. All public comments and responses should be in the spirit of civil public discourse. And as a reminder, please be aware that intentionally disrupting a lawful meeting or the administration of a government function is a criminal offense in Pennsylvania. The school board values the opportunity to hear from the community in person and appreciates your cooperation in advance. Okay, so we'll move through the agenda here. We have no reports from student representatives or other invited speakers. We have no student and staff highlights this evening. We don't even have any pictures behind us. It's a little bit boring. When we have no announcements of additional agenda items. So now we get to the portion of the meeting where there is public participation from district residents and district taxpayers regarding items on the consent agenda. This next item is public participation from district residents and district taxpayers regarding any items on the consent agenda only. If you would like to make a comment on the consent agenda, please line up here at the microphone. When you come to the microphone, state your name and township of residence. We will end comment with the last person in line. As a note for all comments, all public comments this evening will be limited to 3 minutes. Again, this comment period is limited to the consent agenda only. Since your responses to questions will be included in your 3 minutes, please make your entire comment and then the board will determine an appropriate response. So do we have any comments on the consent agenda? Seeing none, we will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is board action regarding amendment of agenda to include additional agenda items. We have none. So then we'll move on to the consent agenda. Our next item is the consent agenda. Although board action is required, it is generally unnecessary to hold discussion on these items. With the consent of all members, they are therefore grouped, and approval is given in one motion. In the event a board member wants to discuss any item, the board president will move it to an appropriate place on the agenda. A board member may vote nay or abstain with respect to a consent agenda item without the need for removing the item from the consent agenda. So the action under consideration is that the Board of School Directors approves the following recommendations on the consent agenda as printed on page 5 of the agenda. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay. With that, we have a first and a second, so we'll have a vote. All those in favor, please say, please indicate by saying aye.
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 All opposed, signify by saying nay. That's it. The ayes have it. The motion has been passed. Okay. With that, we'll move on to a priority discussion. The first item of priority discussion is an agreement listed here as the agreement of sale. The first action under consideration is that the Board of School Directors authorizes the superintendent to enter into an agreement of sale for the property owned by PAMD-NNN Office South Point LLC, 1200 West Swedesford Road, Berwyn, Pennsylvania, Tredyffrin Township, Chester County, Pennsylvania, containing approximately 15 acres, an existing 86,622 square foot existing building having a tax identification number of UPI 43-10-28. The agreement of sale must be in a form acceptable to the solicitor and contain the terms as outlined on page 135 of the agenda materials. Do I have a motion?
Moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. No, we've got a motion that is we've got a motion and a proper second. So Superintendent Dr. Gusick, Business Manager Art McDonald, and Director of Educational Program Dr. Mike Simondera will present more background on this item.
Thank you, President Kantorsek. Dr. Simondera and Mr. McDonald will be here in case there are any further questions about the process. I'll be providing the main commentary, the information. The slides that are presented on the screen will be posted on the website and added to the presentation materials. We have been working on them till very recently. And so I will share some information as we move through our discussion tonight, and we'll offer opportunities for the board and the public to ask questions. As most who live and work in TESD and are aware, the district has been discussing the need for additional space in the form of a new elementary school for some time. And tonight I'm pleased to present an additional option for the board to consider, to provide an additional site that at this point the district administration believes could be a viable site for a sixth elementary school. The presentation this evening will not focus on all the work and public involvement that has taken place to date. We will present a brief overview of the context of tonight's action under consideration, followed by a high-level snapshot of the potential property acquisition, the details of tonight's resolution, and some next steps. If the action is approved this evening, we will hold a public special meeting regarding the district's exploration of options to meet our elementary facilities needs, about site options that we've considered, drivers for additional space, and any other options we might have already taken off the table and ruled out regarding solutions to address our problems and concerns with elementary space. That special meeting will take place in this building on Wednesday, January 17 at 7:30. It'll provide an additional opportunity for public input and questions about the process so far. So briefly, before I provide some of the particulars about the site under consideration, we do have a timeline. Again, this will be available for anybody who wants to see about some of the steps we've taken regarding public engagement and some steps we've taken as a district and board regarding the pursuit of the question of an additional sixth elementary school. We had begun in public engagement of this topic already in the winter of 2020, where I had visited with Dr. Wendy Toll, who monitors district enrollment, all of our 5 elementary schools, right before the pandemic shutdown took place in 2020. At that point, we did want to take stock in what had been taking place, monitor our enrollment, see if there was any shift to that or the shift to our needs with respect to elementary space. And we resumed the process pretty heavily once some of those questions were answered in 2022. We did work with the Chester County Intermediate Unit to identify properties that could be potential school sites already in September of 2022. We've had public meetings to discuss these matters in addition to a yearly monitoring of enrollment, which takes place in education every November. We had a meeting at the January 2023 Education Committee. We redid our public presentations in the elementary school with updated information this past winter, February and March of 2023. We presented to the Finance Committee, Facilities Committee, and to the full board in May of 2023, looking at financing options for a new school, as well as continuing to pursue other options and the ways we could meet the needs for the space demands for our programming. This September, there was an update on that I presented to the board for public consideration. Through the process, there had been suggestions regarding exploring corporate sites. There's an understanding that the corporate sites, not just in TE, but nationally, were being less leased than they had been prior to the pandemic, primarily due to the work from home trend, I guess, that some of which survived the pandemic. It was an option that the district was serious about from the start, and we wanted to take the deepest possible dive into looking at spaces. So in October of this year, we entered into an agreement with Vista Realty Partners, where we worked with Andy Spillard, who would help us focus in on that search for corporate properties and which ones might meet our needs. We continued our examination of enrollment in 2023, confirming that our enrollment was high and stable high. And in December of 2023, we did a report, Dr. Simondera did a report to the Education Committee regarding how those projected enrollments play out with respect to space. On an ongoing level, we've been gathering feedback from community members at all these public meetings, and our inbox at elementary enrollment at tesd.net. We have continued to evaluate, and I'll make mention of 2 properties we currently own that could be considered as school sites, one on First Avenue in Berwyn and one on Jefferson Lane in Chesterbrook, as well as looking at this concept of an adapted reuse of an existing building and what that would mean for repurposing it in terms of how it could be used as an elementary school. I will share with you one slide that Dr. Simondera shared with the Education Committee in December, and that is examining one question that's sometimes asked is, if one of our buildings, and we know Valley Forge Elementary is the highest, most populated school in terms of student enrollments, and if there's empty space in other schools and we redistributed our students through redistricting, would that be a means to solve our concern without taking upon an additional school? Without full-day kindergarten, if we were to redistrict all of our elementary schools as evenly as possible, based upon our demographers' projections of what our enrollment would be next year, what this slide projects is all of the dark spaces are regular classrooms that are used for regular classroom use. The ones that are shaded gray and are squares are regular classrooms that are needed but for non-core use. What I mean by core use is a second grade class, for example, but there are other purposes, other programs, special programs that also require regular classroom space. The larger rectangles are science labs that we'd like to have available so that our students can come out of their regular classrooms and study science in more of a lab setting. It's not a requirement, but when we need to, one of the first places we look is flipping one of those or both of those labs into core space for the use of core instruction or any of these special programs. So you can see on this sheet that 2 of our schools would be filled with core and non-core use, and 3 of our schools would use 1 science classroom, and this is without the addition of full-day kindergarten. So we do believe the need still exists for additional space in our schools. Request was made and honored by Dr. Simondera to let's take a look at that. What if we had a 6th school and we assumed that that 6th school had 28 regular classrooms and 2 science labs and 8 seminar rooms, and then we did an optimal redistricting and applied the class size policy On this slide, it shows that we would have adequate space in all of the schools to provide for the instruction and the special programs with full-day kindergarten without the use of any science labs or other spaces. So before we look at an additional site, we've already discussed and previewed with the community 2 sites that we own as a district. And they are sites that, according to our design team, are possible to house an elementary school. First in First Avenue in Berwyn, and second with Jefferson Lane and Chesterbrook. And before I talk about the particulars related to that, this is a map on the screen that shows a heat map of where our students, current elementary students, live in the district, with those red and yellow areas being more areas of high concentration of students, and then the lighter colors on that map. So in particular, we would be looking for, as much as possible, a school in the north and west part of the township. The dots that you can see, I know it's hard to see on this, you can catch it if you need to see it online. The dot at the very top left is the Jefferson Lane site, and then that middlemost dot, almost equidistant between the 2 yellow spaces in the center of the map, is the Berwyn site. And by that standpoint, at least, the Jefferson Lane site is closer to the population location. So just to further, before we look at a third site, some of the assets associated with these sites we own and limitations. The site in Berwyn did formerly house an elementary school. One of its drawbacks, we'd like to have a 15-acre site, and most cases say that that's sort of a minimum site you want to deal with to have adequate parking and play spaces for students and wide enough egress and ingress into the space, as well as to hold the plant itself. This is an 8.5-acre site, so smaller. It's less ideal with respect to size. It's also less ideal with consideration to population. It is flat and has been developed before, so from a topographical standpoint, there's less cutting and filling of earth that would need to take place that would potentially add to expense. And it's accessible by 2 roads, First Avenue and Bridge Avenue. More than one road is preferable to bring and have traffic not all in and out on the same road. Currently, part of that, though, is used as a playing field, and that is something that, you know, on one hand, we're expanding to add fields to our, right next to, adjacent to this property at Conestoga, and it would be less than ideal to also have to lose a field in that process, but that's something that we could examine different solutions for. In terms of Chesterbrook, this property was deeded to the school district in the 80s for the purpose of building an elementary school. It's a site that's 15.4 acres. It's a good location with respect to population. The topography on Jefferson Lane isn't as advantageous as that on First Avenue in Berwyn. And it's also observed that the main access road to this property is through Jefferson Lane. We understand that there are 4 communities that also use Jefferson Lane to access to that road. It's not necessarily a deal breaker, but certainly it brings traffic into Jefferson Lane and must reroute it out back through Jefferson Lane as well in order to get everybody in and out of school. So we'd said in our presentations in the spring that we were not committed to one of these 2 sites. They were viable sites. Each of them have advantages and disadvantages, and we could have that conversation. But the decision to build a school is a serious commitment, and one we haven't taken since 1965. So we needed to make sure that all stones were overturned. Once a school's built, you can't just pick it up and move it, right? So we want to have the most ideal spot. So if we were to extend this notion of how we might be able to apply that to the current corporate space market, what would a property look like in that type of world? And what parameters could we provide to Mr. Spillard or Vista Realty in looking for properties that might serve our needs? We're looking for a site of 15 or more acres. We'd like a building that had approximately 80,000 square footage of usable space. That's about the square footage that it would take for us to have that 28 classroom elementary school that mirrors the current programming use of our other 5 schools. We'd want the cost to be in the range of the other costs that it would be for us to develop an existing property. Ideally, an elementary school would not be some skyscraper type building of 5 or 6 stories. So we wanted that limited to 3 stories. If possible, a good location with respect to population. Again, the farther the school is built away from the population center, then the longer time they have to spend on the bus, the more traffic it creates in the community. And especially with the challenges that we've had with bus routes, we'd like to certainly limit that time. So corporate sites are laid out rather differently. Some are very small, and possibly we could purchase the entirety of a corporate site if it met the other parameters. Others are much larger and have multiple buildings on them. If so, it wouldn't be great to have a parcel in the center of that and have corporate sites all around that one particular school, given that all of our other schools are situated in a neighborhood. However, if we could find a corporate site where there might be a building on the edge of that that did have some adjacent neighborhood or access that look and feel that would be similar to that, that would be preferable to one located in the center, looking again for that neighborhood adjacency. So Vista Realty did identify for us about 18 properties to consider, and that at least met some of these parameters. I can tell you that a thorough examination of the properties available led to several themes. Most of them are not 15 or more acres. So you're either going to get a site that's too small, or you're going to have to buy adjacent properties, and that can be complicated and expensive. In some cases, the building on it was way too large. And you'd think, well, what's wrong with that? You know, who would be opposed to having more space? The issue is, I learned a lot about corporate realty in the last year, that a lot of times the sale price for those sites is connected to the square footage of leasable space. So if that's true, and you have a building on it that's 100,000 square feet or 120,000 square feet, the price of those properties being driven by that square foot can take it out of the range of real affordability, right? To buy that and renovate it and do whatever changes you need to have that turned into an elementary school would make it prohibitively expensive. And if you are in the business of corporate realty, part of what you should be achieving is maximizing the amount of square footage you can get on a property so that you can rent or lease your properties to the greatest extent possible. So most properties that are 15 or more acres are overbuilt with respect to the amount of square footage on the property, and it made it challenging for us to look at that. Or they had multiple buildings, right? You could get maybe a 15-acre site with 2 buildings on them, but we don't need 2 buildings. And again, we'd be paying to have a building we didn't need that we might have to possibly take down. Most of them were not situated where you could really join them together in a useful way. So one single building with 80,000 square feet was pretty rare. In some cases, if you look at some of the ways the subdivisions of properties take place in corporate areas, there are some odd subdivisions leading one property being divided with a line where 2 buildings are super close together, but the dividing line goes between them, and that's not ideal for an elementary school to be 100 feet away from another corporate building either. So a lot of these things took many of the properties out of consideration. The property we're going to share with you tonight far and above met the qualifications that that we'd set forward in terms of these parameters. So first, going back to the heat map, that yellow arrow indicates the location of 1200 West Sweetsford Road, South Point 3, right, for those who might recognize it as such. For those who aren't familiar, just to place this, if you're coming from Sweetsford Road from Barnes & Noble and you're heading toward Paoli, you would pass 202, you'd go past Casat, and if you made a left, that would take you up to Hillside and Conestoga and TE Middle. If you pass that intersection, there's a rise in the road, and eventually there's an intersection at Howellville, and 252 keeps going straight, and to stay on Sweetsford, you'd make a right. Right before that intersection, there's another traffic light, where if you made a right at that traffic light, you'd be in the West Lakes Corporate Center, and if you made a left at that traffic light, you'd be in South Point, and that's the property that we'd be looking at on the map. And there's an aerial view of that map on the left side of this screen, and we'll see a few more shots of that in the coming slides. So one of the things that made this unique was it was a 15.2 acre site with one existing 3-story building, approximately 86,000 square feet. So that really met the space requirements well without being overbuilt. It is a good location with respect to student population. It's already been developed, right? So the topography is relatively flat. The access is considerably better than either of the other locations that we currently own in terms of bus pickup, potential parent pickup. The access would be on the front side from Sweetsford Road. There's adjacency on the south side of the property to Howellville Road that we can't guarantee could be a potential entrance, but it's something we could explore to potentially have 2 entrances onto the site to help with egress and ingress onto the property and traffic at drop-off and dismissals. There is a neighborhood of homes along Howellville Road to which this is adjacent. And from a cursory view of the building, the layout would support conversion to an elementary classroom layout. I'll talk a little bit more about that. It surely wouldn't be easy, but you need to look at the inside of a building to see just exactly how difficult that would be to get the shape of classrooms and hallways without removing load-bearing walls or without having to totally relocate ventilation systems or plumbing in a way that is really feasible. And this met that initial test. There's a lot, though, to be explored with respect to that. One of the things that made this site unique is that it was originally intended to have 2 buildings instead of just 1. And this overhead view shows the concept, at least, of how an additional 80,000 square foot building could have been placed on that site but was never built, which is fortunate for the Tredyffrin Easttown School District, because had that been built, it would have been likely fallen into the same category as many other properties that we were looking at, in that the cost of it would have been too expensive. You would have had to buy 2 buildings, and subdividing it with those buildings too close would have likely taken that parcel out of consideration. So, in terms of adaptive reuse, one study is an examination of the layout of the building to determine whether or not a renovation can take place for reuse as a school. But even the most ideal corporate building cannot house everything a school might need. It's hard to envision a gymnasium easily fit into the envelope of any corporate building that we'd look at, given its height requirements and space requirements. There are also concerns with areas such as a cafeteria kitchen, which require a lot of extra plumbing and ventilation that's hard to put on a first floor, in a school, right? So what this building and really any corporate site is likely to need in addition to a renovation of the building into a school, is an additional expansion of the footprint to include some spaces that are not really easily fit into the existing structure. So if you look at this visual, again, we haven't and won't be able to show detailed schematics, but in theory, an addition could be placed next to that on land that is flat and was designed for development that could accommodate any spaces that can't fit within the current building architecture. So I'd like to be clear about your vote tonight, right, and the resolution that you are considering. We do not have in place at the moment, we've been in discussion with the owners of this property, a executable agreement of sale for you to view and consider. What you're voting on is a resolution authorizing us to enter into an agreement of sale that meets certain parameters and conditions. I'd like to review those because we have gotten this far in the discussions regarding the acquisition of this property that these would really need to be baked into any agreement that we could hope to get signed by both sides, if that makes sense. So if the process would follow through to its conclusion, the purchase price would be $15.95 million. If we sign an agreement, the district would pay a 2% deposit within 3 days of the signing agreement. And then I'd like to talk about this period known as due diligence. Once we have an agreement of sale, we would go into a 60-day period for due diligence. And if there are individuals in the public who have questions that aren't answered tonight, if you have 20, I might have 200. There's lots of questions we would need to get answers to regarding this property before it would reach its natural conclusion and us taking the steps to put a school there. A lot of these questions are going to be answered during that 60-day period of due diligence. It's at that point we do not own the property now. We don't have authorization to do soil testing, environmental studies, structural examinations of the building. All of those things are important considerations for the board and the district before moving forward. We are optimistic, hopeful that all of those requirements would be satisfied. It's sort of like, though, when you buy a house, there is a home inspection process, and could something be discovered during that process that might alter the deal or give the buyer potential pause? Absolutely. So that could take place during due diligence. I think that one of the most areas of deepest curiosity will be the price of the project. I have those questions as well. We can't provide a total cost of the estimate this evening. It isn't that $15.95 million. That's simply to acquire the property. On one hand, it seems like a project like this would be less expensive than new construction, because logic suggests that renovation would be cheaper than new construction from scratch. We're looking at putting a finer point on the costs of renovating the three-story building, but it's not a small renovation. The existing envelope can be reconfigured. It really is a complete gutting of the school that would be required. So whatever the cost of that renovation would be added to that, plus any addition of expansion of the footprint. We'd need to know what those costs were as well. So you'd add the cost of the renovation, plus the costs of any addition, plus the costs of acquiring the property. In this case, we know to be $15.95 million. And at that point, we could be approaching the costs of building a school on a property we already own, possibly even exceeding them somewhat. We're not certain. So we can't know those things until we can get on the site and do that work, and then we'll be putting a finer point on the price as we move forward. Let me go on to this. So if there is something that is discovered during the 60-day due diligence period We can say this is not a place that is that's usable as an elementary school. If that's true, and through diligence we discover something about the property that makes it unusable, then we would receive the deposit back, and we'd be looking at our other options for elementary school construction. If there is another decision, right, it's not unusable as an elementary school, but the board decides for a different reason not to put the school there anyway, we still can step away from this process and receive the deposit back, but less $100,000. That is, we wouldn't be having this conversation tonight if we were not willing to make that commitment. The other interested parties could weigh in on this property, and this commitment makes this ability to develop a purchase and sale agreement possible. If we get through the due diligence period and it's still a go, in 30 days, within 30 days of that, we would still have the opportunity then to close the sale of the property with the seller. And at that point, it would become the property of TE for the purposes of building an elementary school. And we certainly hope to have all your questions answered by then, the questions by the public. And I think our meeting on January 17th, which I guess I'll get to on the next slide, we won't have all the answers. That's just 15 days from now. We don't have an agreement yet with the sellers. Once that takes place, we'll be at the beginning of the due diligence process. We certainly can aggregate your questions, try to get them answered as soon as possible. That's not the only opportunity we're going to have for public discussion of this, but we wanted to basically get one on the books that would invite anybody, especially those who are sort of paying attention, but maybe they want us to start from the beginning. Right at that meeting, we'll give more information about how we got here. And I'll do a review in depth with some of the studies and presentations that we've already provided and allow for questions at that point. So if this moves forward tonight with your vote, we will, the 7th isn't a hard deadline, but we'd be looking to move forward with getting the finer points on the purchase and sale agreement as soon as possible to start this timeline. So hopefully that would happen sometime within the next 5 days. Then the due diligence period would take till early March. And if there are still no problems or concerns remaining at that point, we could close on the property in early April. So I don't know if Dr. Simondera, Mr. McDonald, if you think I left out any key points. At this point, I turn it back to you, President Kantorsek, and take questions from the board.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gusick. So I will do just that. Turn it to the board and see if folks have any comments or questions for the administration on the presentation we just heard. Okay, Dr. Hatinsky.
Well, I just say I appreciate that you brought this forward, and we had heard a lot from the community about their interest in reviewing a commercial property and the potential for adaptive reuse. So I appreciate that it's an option that's been well investigated, and I mostly look forward to hearing from the audience. But thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Steedy.
Thank you. I too appreciate the look at this is certainly something different than we've ever thought about before. And just one thing strikes me when I look at the overhead shots of it. It's a building that is surrounded by parking lots, and that's not how we usually see an elementary school. So could you talk a little bit about that? I'm thinking, how are the children going to play? And it just, you know, that's what a corporate space is. I get that. But if we're going to make this into an elementary school, what are your thoughts on the outside?
So I appreciate that. Actually, from an environmental standpoint, there's a few things. One, we would be adapting a space with respect to, as opposed to building from scratch. But also, we're likely to reduce impervious coverage. There'll be some expansion of the footprint, but all of that parking you can see within the red line on the picture isn't needed, and playground and play field space would be needed. From my vantage point, the property along the Swedesford Road side would be more conducive to staff and visitor parking and the bus drop-off. And this is preliminary, right? So it could change with some of this study, right? But that back side of the property, looking at the bottom part of that picture, is adjacent to landscape company and some homes, access to Howellville Road. There's a pond back there, and I certainly could envision more field space back in that space and play areas that would seem more secluded without hearing the traffic of Swedesford Road. It would be more Howellville Road and neighborhood facing.
Yes, Dr. Allen.
So I too, oh, that was loud. So I too appreciate the administration's hard work in in working with outside vendors to try to come up with, a larger list of options for our community. This has been excellent. It's been long going, but it's an excellent an opportunity for us to really look at all of our options, the ones that are presented to us, recognizing that we live in, a very popular area for families, and building a school in this area. We just don't have the space or the land. So, I'm just grateful that we have the various options. But my question really is around the difference in the time to build for a potential corporate center versus the other two properties. I know Jefferson Lane may present problems because we would have to level the surface, et cetera. The Berwyn site has other challenges, but it's also a level field. A question that could come up is, now that we see a flat surface, an existing building, does that reduce the time, you think, for constructing a new school?
So,
Or do you think it's about the same? Thank you.
No, I think so. There's a timeline for any construction project that's developed in advance by our design team, and then reality takes place, right? And so a number of things that could happen regardless of a renovation versus the construction of a new place. One is when we go through the approvals process and both of these, in the two sites that we own in Tredyffrin and one in Easttown Township, would have to go through their own process to receive approvals, and that's a public process as well. And sometimes that can take time to move through. It's hard to predict exactly what will happen at those meetings or what questions those officials might have for the district. Sometimes it takes several meetings to get through the approvals process. The construction the construction timeline itself would be shorter for a property such as this. Once we get through approvals, the construction should be shorter. Now, some of this we could discover in due diligence. If there's rock underneath that needs to be removed, that could be a challenge. If there's soil that needs to be replaced for one reason or another, that can add timeline. We don't know the answers to that. The short answer, though, is it should take a few months off. We had said 3 years and 9 months is an estimate based on all the unknowns for a brand new school. So the initial estimate would maybe be, at least an initial talk with our architects, 3 or 4 months shorter than that. But again, there's many opportunities for delays that can happen with construction and the public bidding process and approvals.
Yes, Ms. Piccioni.
Dr. Allen's question reminds me of when Easttown residents may remember the building of the Easttown Library. My question is, might there be a cursory study of if renovation of the property on Swedesford Road is not available once we've signed the agreement? Might there be an option for a complete tear down? That's exactly what happened with the Easttown Library. We had the plans, we went to the public. It was renovation of the existing shell of the building. It was already designed to be a library. And then we recognized that the that though it was designed originally as a library, we weren't able to provide the facilities of a more modern library, shall we say, and also there were some structural situations that did not allow for renovation. So complete change, it turned out to be a knockdown, and we rebuilt the library. So would there be an option, well, at least some kind of an estimate, time-wise and cost-wise, if there is the need to knock the building down?
I don't know if Mr. McDonald has any thoughts on that. I think that if it turned out that a complete demolition and reconstruction was required, I would think that that would add prohibitively to the cost of the project, and you'd have a decision to make. And that would be if something unusable was discovered about the building itself. I don't know, Mr. McDonald, if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree with what you said.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we go to the public? Yes, Dr. Singh.
Thank you for the presentation again. As you have this slide up here, it kind of reminds me of your search. The search for looking at a corporate center was a little like Goldilocks. And, you checked off a couple of things and very important points. No site was going to have everything. We all
Right.
know that, right? That's reality. But as far as corporate sites go, in the limited Tredyffrin Township, East Town, based on the heat map, I don't think you could have found, in my opinion, from your presentation, a better spot in being familiar with the area. I think the other important thing that you mentioned is this resolution really has an important part of it is you are going to protect the interests of the district. And this resolution authorizes an agreement of sale that spells out what you talked about. We are not 100% going to sign a check over today to this company and be done. There's a due diligence period, and there are opportunities where the public, where there are things that could be found through due diligence that could potentially prevent this from happening. So I look forward to your other presentation on January 17th. I think that will also be a very important tie-in with all the presentations that have occurred over the last 2 years. This is my second year on the board. I've heard all of them. I've been in the education committee. We've been at the board meetings. And there's some important points that I think would be a good summary finding for the public on January 17th.
Thank you.
Anything else from the board for now? We have another chance after public comment. So, okay, seeing none, the board now invites members of the audience to comment on this item. If you have comments or questions, please step up to the microphone and identify yourself. Just as a reminder, comments will be limited to 3 minutes, and the comments are limited to residents and taxpayers. So when you come up, please identify your township of residence. So do we have any comments?
Hi, Sarah McNew. I'm from the Tredyffrin Township. My first board meeting, so thank you for having me. I do have a question just regarding timeline of this. It seems fast. So when was the district, when did the district begin negotiations with Brandywine, who is, I know, the owner of this property? The other questions I have is when the decision, was made to move forward with this particular property, other than the other 18 on the list. And given that there's supposed to be an agreement signed in the next 4 days, is there a draft agreement already in place?
I'll first turn to our solicitor to answer, to talk about some of the questions in terms of, because obviously we, there's every meeting, and thank you for coming because and by the way, I should ask, were those all your?
That is my questions,
Okay,
yeah.
great. So, every meeting we have executives, we have an announcement of what executive session. And a lot of times we talk about things like real estate in those sections, in those executive sessions, for particular reasons, because we're not, it's not good to be talking about negotiations of real estate and property, and be able to do that to the best advantage of the district. And so with that background in mind, I'll turn to Ken. She has some specific questions about when we began negotiations and when the decision was made and sort of what we can talk about with that.
Well, as President Kantorsek said, we really don't want to compromise any sort of negotiating position we have by disclosing by disclosing the negotiation history or anything publicly. Yeah, the answer to your question is are there drafts agreements? The answer is yes. I can't comment on any of those terms of that agreement other than what you've seen on the screen and what's in the resolution.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Jay Joyce from Tredyffrin. Happy New Year. Just two quick questions. What's the square footage of the other elementary schools that we have, like Beaumont? What would the square footage be? And question number two is, assuming we go through with the purchase, where's the money come from?
Go ahead. Do you can respond to those questions?
Go ahead.
We on? This on? Okay. They range from the low 70s to close to 80,000. Well, that's going to be a decision of the board in the future. There's going to be obviously several options. I think you were at the meeting where we discussed options for funding a new elementary school. Right, but and we said a combination.
This is quick.
Well, we said a combination, and that answer doesn't change from then to now. A combination of what we'd have either in reserves or what we would issue in bonds or bank loans and the like,
So,
and
yeah,
what
we'd have
gets
to issue
contributed
bonds
to
and
the
like-
capital fund between now and the time of purchase.
Typically, we have the opportunity in Finance Committee to discuss those options. So if there's any decisions for the board to make regarding its financing, or at least the financing of the $15.95 million, that would be an opportunity at those meetings to discuss that publicly.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, Maura Redmond, Tredyffrin. I have a cold. Two questions. One, what year was the building built? As Ms. Piccioni had concerns regarding the Easttown Library, just wondering when this building was built so that we would know how much renovation might be needed. And then secondly, are you using eminent domain in any way to use as part of the purchase price?
Go ahead.
Trying to get the year that the building was constructed. I believe it was in the 90s.
Okay.
But I'll try to get the precise year to you before the end of the meeting, if we're able to do that. Do we have an answer to that?
1994, I believe.
1994. Okay, thank you. And then the second question, sorry.
Eminent domain.
Oh, eminent domain. At this point, it's been a negotiation between the two parties. Is that, should we say more than that?
The board has not taken any action along the lines of an eminent domain.
Okay, is that something that the board might consider?
As we stated, we really can't, we're not in a position to discuss negotiation strategy or other things like that. Any school district and any municipal government has the ability to take property by eminent domain. This is a negotiated agreement of sale.
Okay, thank you.
Could add that the property that was built in 94 did receive a renovation in 2007.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, Pamela Zakalars, Tredyffin resident. I just wanted to thank you. That's it. I'm a current parent of a kindergartner. I'm about to have a 4-year-old in 2 months, and I have a 1-year-old. And I think the 6 and the 4, this will be gone. But I have a shot for the 1-year-old, and I just really appreciate it. And it may seem fast, but 3 years, 9 months is a really long time away. And I really appreciate the forward momentum that this is getting. And I know from a lot of parents that have 0 to 6, this will be hugely impactful for our parents. So as a representative for that group, thank you for taking this seriously and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Do we have any other comments from the public? Okay, seeing none, I'll turn it back to the board. Any additional questions or comments from the board? Okay, well, I will just add again, thank you for bringing this option to us and providing the presentation. Like others here, I am looking forward to the January 17th presentation, and I would encourage those who are interested in this issue about whether to build a new elementary school and why we might be doing so, and the various considerations concerning location. I strongly encourage folks to attend. That meeting will be devoted just to that issue, and we'll have plenty of time for public comment and plenty of room, because I believe we're planning on having it in the auditorium.
If necessary,
Here
right.
if necessary, here at Conestoga. So with that, where were we here? I sort of went backwards. Okay, so we have no further comments here on this resolution. A motion has been made and seconded. I will now ask Mr. McDonald to conduct a roll call vote. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Dr. Singh,
Yes.
Ms. Audrain,
Yes.
Mr. Hong,
I abstain for personal reasons.
Dr. Hatinsky,
Yes.
Ms. Weil,
Yes.
Ms. Piccioni,
No.
Dr. Allen,
Yes.
Vice President Teedy,
Yes.
President Kantorsek.
Yes.
Motion passes, right? 7
Motion-
to 1 to 1.
Motion passes 7 to 1 to 1. So thank you. Supposed to hit the gavel, right? It doesn't say that here in the comments. I just like hitting the gavel. It's fun. Okay, thank you. So the next action under consideration is that the Board of School Directors authorizes the administration to make the 2024-25 preliminary budget proposal available inspection not later than today, January 2nd, 2024. So I believe as part of this, it's authorized the administration to provide public notice not later than January 12th, 2024, that the board intends to adopt a preliminary budget at its regularly scheduled meeting on January 22nd, 2024. Authorize the administration to take any and all actions necessary to ensure legal compliance with approval of the preliminary budget. And then authorize the administration to publish notice of the intent to file for referendum exceptions with the Pennsylvania Department of Education at least 1 week prior to filing for such exceptions, and to file for such exceptions not later than February 8th, 2024, adopted the second date of January 2024. So do I have a motion?
Motion presented.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. With that, I will turn to the board for, well, actually, I'm sorry. Business Manager Art McDonald will present on this item. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you. So tonight, we're considering a board vote on the budget for the 24-25 fiscal year. Seems like it's far off, and it is. So this is the beginning of the process that we will march between now and June to approve a final budget to meet a timeline for the state. You have an option tonight to approve a budget that will allow us to display the budget for 20 days preceding your 22nd meeting, the January 22nd meeting. And it will allow you to keep your options open for filing for exceptions and then considering those exceptions as we go through the budget process. That's what's on the agenda this evening. The deadline to approve a preliminary budget according to the state or to pass a resolution to stay at or below the index, and I'll show that in a slide coming up, is January 24th. So our January 22nd meeting that we still have on the books, we'll have another chance to talk about the budget, and we still have another opportunity to pass a resolution to stay at or below that Act 1 index. The timeline for the budget process on the screen right here is, obviously we're in the January meeting stage. We're going to have opportunities to get well into the details of the budget, both the staffing, the revenue and expense side of that in our March and April budget workshops. Regardless of what we do here tonight, we're going to have those workshops and talk about the budgets during that process. We're going to have finance committee meetings this coming month. We'll also in February, and we'll have front-end finance committee meetings in March and April. We'll have them in May, and typically we'll have another meeting in June before we look at the final budget adoption on June 10th. This was the slide that we presented at Finance not too long ago, and you'll see the different columns here of no new tax revenue in column B, and Act 1 index in column C, and in column D, Act 1 plus exceptions. So the budget that's going on display is the column D, Act 1 plus exceptions. Giving us the authority to file for those does not mean that we're taking the exceptions. It merely means that we would be filing with PDE to determine whether we're eligible to take exceptions. So you can't just take them on your own. You do have to get approval from PDE, and to do that you must fill out an application online. That website is not open yet in Harrisburg. When they do open it, based on your vote tonight, we would file for those and then bring it back to the board and let you know whether we're eligible for those exceptions or not, and to what amount and dollar amount and rate from taxable percentage that you would be authorized to be able to increase taxes by, in addition to the index. In the development that we talked about in finance of this particular budget, these are some of the highlights of the budget that we're looking at preliminarily, and we're still building in a capital funds transfer of $6 million. You recall at some previous finance committee meetings, it was mentioned earlier by someone in the public that how are we going to pay for a new elementary school? Well, capital funds transfer was a large part of what we would be doing in big steps to pay for not only a new elementary school, but also the athletic fields project and then infrastructure projects. So we talked about a scenario actually that moves a limit of $9 million in each fiscal year. And we talked about 24-25 being that first year of $9 million. At this point, we don't think we have the tax base to be able to produce $9 million. You recall that in this past year, in 22-23, we were only able to move $5 million. That means we're not even at the $6 million rate to be able to move to the capital funds. So to do that, you'd have to get to a point where you're producing enough money to be able to move additional monies up to that $9 million. We haven't been able to do that yet. So in the 24-25 budget, we're putting in $6 million in the budget to transfer over to the capital fund to be able to continue the scenario that we presented in finance. We'll talk about, more financing options, obviously, as we go forward and put a finer point on what the budget looks like and what the final cost projections are for the new elementary school if we go through and purchase the property that we just discussed earlier this evening. Projected debt service for those particular projects that I just mentioned. We also saw presentations from Raymond James and Finance that estimated the debt service for those type of projects will be around $2 million. That's also in the budget because there's a distinct possibility that you could be looking at a borrowing in this current fiscal year, which would mean you'd have to have 2 years to build up to the debt service. Remember, we're talking about a budget that goes all the way through to June of 2025. We're not even in June of 2024 yet, so we have 18 months to consider when we approve this budget. The special education budget currently has an increase of about $1.6 million. We'll dive into that in great detail in our workshops. And a technology budget of about $1 million increase. And then we have projected professional staffing additions that we'll get into likely in our March budget workshop in detail. That's about $763,000. Retention bonus that was part of the recently negotiated CBA for the professional staff. And then early on, first look projections for healthcare have us at 10% for medical and 3% for script and 10% for dental. I'm hoping that those numbers are going to go down. We've seen some pretty good experience in healthcare over the recent years, and it's been smaller increases than that. So we'll look at a second look in March and April, and I'll bring that back to the board, and hopefully we'll see some reductions there. One item that's not on the slide, we recently learned that the PSERS rate is going to be less than what we projected in this particular budget. The PSERS board puts out a projection of about 5 years out of where they think the rates are going to be, and they are going to keep the rate down and try to control that percentage. So the next time we bring an iteration of this budget to you in finance, it will be likely less by close to $300,000 for that reduction. So that's good news. All right, I mentioned this briefly at the beginning of the presentation. These are the two options in a preliminary budget process. We're in the option 1 lane tonight of what's on the agenda. You still have option 2 available to you tonight, and you'll have it available to you on the 22nd. Once we get past the 22nd, whatever you decide will determine what we do marching forward as far as the budget goes and what we send into the state and what the state authorizes us as far as a tax increase. So tonight, passing a resolution gives us a preliminary budget. It'll be on display between now and the 22nd. It's displayed in the admin building. If anybody wants to come in and see that document, they're welcome to do that, and a public inspection copy on file. It also authorizes us to file for exceptions and bring those back to you if we're eligible. And again, that's up to PDE whether we're eligible. They'll come back to us at a later time and let us know that. Unfortunately, I can't give you the exact date, but it's typically it'll be mid to late February likely. And then that allows us to meet the state deadline to pass a preliminary budget by the 24th of January between now and the 22nd meeting. This is just an informational slide on Act 1 for folks that are not familiar with that limits the tax increase. And it also talks about referendum exceptions and what they're available for. There are 2 currently available for special ed expenditures and retirement expenses. I mentioned that the state has kept the rate pretty consistent the last couple of years, and when you do a referendum calculation for an exception, you're looking at 2 distinct fiscal years and the differences between those 2 distinct fiscal years from an expense side of the house. So if you're looking at a special ed exception, it goes back to 2 previous actual years. It looks at your expenses that you file with the state through your annual financial report, does a calculation, looks at the difference between those 2 expenses. In other words, how much has those expenses gone up? It takes the percentage of the index, removes whatever that percentage is, if it's 5.3, and it says, okay, 5.3% of that you can cover with the index. What is over the index that you can't cover with that 5.3? That's the amount of the exception that we've estimated on that slide. So in other words, our special ed expenses have gone up in 2 of the previous actual fiscal years by more than what's going to be on this next slide, which is close to $1.4 million. It does the same type of calculation for PSERS, but since the PSERS employer cost rate has been fairly consistent, the difference in the fiscal years really is nothing or very little at that point. It's only a difference between what the salary goes up. As long as the percentage stays the same, you don't typically see a large increase. So in doing those preliminary calculations, again, they're estimates at this point. We would file with the state to determine the exact numbers, but this slide shows you what the estimates are for those 2 exceptions, and the special ed exception is the only one that we're projecting we're eligible for, and that percentage is a little over 1% and producing $1,367,000, and the Act 1 index at 5.3. So if we would file and get an authorization back from the state on what we're eligible for, we're estimating that to be slightly over 6.3% at this time and produce revenue of about $8.5 million. I just put this in here for informational purposes since we're talking about fund balance and the balances that are in there and what's available to either spend on a capital fund expenditure or purchase of a property and the like that we talked about earlier. We do have some money that's committed to capital projects funds, and you can see that here. So that's something that's available. Just so you know, the board can recommit fund balances on this list at any time they choose, and you could recommit $15 million and purchase a building, and there are options available within funding for doing either a bond issue or doing a bank loan later and reimbursing yourself, and we can get into that at a finance committee meeting, and we will, as another option for funding and purchase of a property. This is a slide we started adding a number of years ago, and I think it says a lot in that, even though we're producing additional revenue streams through tax increases, which really your only vehicle to increase revenue in this particular school district, we're still facing a deficit when we do that. So if you look across from left to right on the slide, you can see we're starting with what we're producing in general fund revenue in column A, which includes what you're doing as a tax increase in the general fund, and it looks at your operating expenses along with what you're transferring to the capital fund, and then it's also looking at what you're spending in the capital fund. So those are part of entity-wide expenditures for this school district. So even though we approve a budget in the general fund, there are things happening in the capital fund that are impacted by how much revenue you're able to produce, and then of course what you borrow or what you issue in bonds. So the total expenses outweigh the revenue in pretty much every year except one on this particular slide, and the deficit for the last actual year is about $7.4 million. That deficit that you see at the bottom of the slide has been filled with bond issues or bank loans over that period of time, and that's how we're able to remain solvent and do the projects that we do, and do that in a way that makes a lot of sense fiscally, especially when we're confined by Act 1, which we have been since 2006. Key dates coming up for us. We will publish a public notice on the 12th that allows us to meet the timeline of the state, which is a 10-day advance adoption notice of a vote on the 22nd for the preliminary budget. The deadline to publish notice of intent is February 1st, and we will publish that notice if it's approved this evening and file on the 8th. I mentioned the 2 workshops in March and April, and then we'll come back to you in April that month for proposed final budget, and then the final budget adoption in June. That's all the slides I have this evening. I certainly welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Appreciate that. Here we are again at the start of another budget cycle. So just to reiterate to folks, we're at the very beginning of this process, and this is just the process that we need to take every year in order to be able to comply with our requirements to set budgets for what is essentially 18 months in advance. And so we're early on in this stage. There's going to be a bunch of refinement associated with this budget, really up until June, which is the time that it's the final meeting and the final time where we have to approve a budget as required by law. So with that, I will turn it to the rest of the board and see if anybody has any comments or questions for Mr. McDonald.
No, so I have a question actually.
Go ahead.
Sorry. For you also, President Kantorsek, can you just explain what so if we vote on the resolution as presented, what that means for the January 22nd meeting? I understand we'll also have a priority discussion on the budget then, so that if we vote for the resolution as presented, that this is not necessarily the final
Correct.
vote on
Correct.
whether we will apply for the exceptions.
And Mr. McDonald can correct me if I'm wrong, but as he mentioned in his presentation, really the deadline for purposes of applying for the exceptions and letting the state know that we're going to be doing that is January 24th. We have a meeting set up for January 22nd to take that vote, that specific vote. In order to be able to have the option to take that vote at all, we have to put on for public display the budget that includes applying for those exceptions 20 days in advance, i.e. today. So that this resolution for today is really just setting up the options for us on the 22nd to be able to decide whether we're going to, in fact, apply for those exceptions, or we're going to pass a resolution to stay at or below the Act 1 index. And so this is not the final say on that question, so thank you for asking me that to clarify that. So this is not the final answer on that question. It really is but a necessary precursor in order to be able to have that question in front of us on the 22nd. Yes, Ms. Weil.
Yeah, just to follow up very briefly, because I had essentially the exact same question, just to clarify it one more time. Under option 1 on the slide on page 141, the first box checked is pass the resolution, and the second box to check is authorize the administration to file for exceptions. If we pass the resolution tonight, it does not necessarily mean that the administration will file for the exception, correct? That decision will be made on January 22nd. Is that correct?
That is my understanding. Mr. McDonald, will you confirm that?
Sure, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Ms. Teedy.
So you said that the state website, Mr. McDonald, is not even open yet for you to formally file. You've done these calculations based on past practice with them, right?
Right.
When do you anticipate that they would open it? I know you don't have any special way to know, but just based on history, when would you think you would be able to file, and how long would it take us to know exactly what those exceptions would amount to?
I would say typically, and this is a little bit of a different year because all the deadlines are earlier in the Act 1 filings, which this would be one of them because the primary date is earlier. So I would anticipate that it would have already been open, but I understand that they're populated with data that comes from the annual financial reports that get filed by school districts, and I'm also have knowledge that a lot of school districts have not yet filed AFRs, so I imagine that's probably delaying the process in Harrisburg, and maybe they don't open the site up until they have received all that. So we have made a couple phone calls. We haven't got anything specific, but we are checking the website pretty much every day to see if it's been open. Once you file, the deadline has to pass for everybody to file, so once that deadline passes in February, then within a couple weeks we would hear back.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, Dr. Singh.
So if you file for the exception and you don't get it, what does that mean as far as this resolution is concerned?
So it hasn't been my experience where you wouldn't get something if we're projecting we're eligible for it. Typically what would happen is the percentage might be different, or the dollar amount calculation might be slightly lower or higher based on our projection. If it would come back and say that you're not eligible for anything, then it just limits your authorization to the Act 1 index if you're not eligible to go above that based on the filing.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So basically on the 143 slide, or page 143, our calculated special education expenditure of 1.011%, what is the 1.01% of what? Our budget?
No, it's the representation of that particular amount of revenue as a percentage of a tax rate increase. So
Okay.
it's kind of working backwards from the dollar amount to the tax rate.
Gotcha. So
Right.
the if you apply for the expenditures, as you said previously, the only point would be they say, well, it's not 1.367, it may be 1 point whatever, or 800. But at least it's some percentage of what the last 2-year expenditures were for the district.
Right. So let me answer the first part of what you said. If they came back with a different number, we would again work backwards to whatever
Okay.
equates to as a tax rate. The calculation of the exception really is looking at 2 fiscal years of actual data, what we would file in the AFR. That's why there's the holdup with I believe the opening the site is the filing of the AFR. So that annual financial report for 2 years, it looks at the cost of special ed in those 2 years, and it says how much has it gone up from one year to the next. So the increase has been significant enough that it's been over 5.3% as a number of revenue. In other words, what's 5.3% as a projection percentage of that expenditure? And then it says, whatever the difference is, you're eligible for an exception. So it's a little bit of a different calculation. But it does look at, I think it's important to note that it's looking at an actual expenditure. The reason the exceptions were developed is for things that the board can't really not do. In other words, if we have special expenditures, we have to provide those services. It impacts us. If the index is limited to a certain amount, the referendum exceptions allows you to go over that to pay for those mandatory type things. Same for retirement percentage, that we don't really have a choice. Whatever the state sets the percentage at, we must pay as a percentage of our salary. So it allows you to file for an exception for that particular expense.
Okay.
Other questions or comments from the board? Okay. So now the board invites members of the audience to comment on this item. If you have comments or questions, please step to the microphone, identify yourself by name and township of residence, and remember, comments are limited to 3 minutes. Have any comments? Okay. Seeing none, I will turn it back to the board to see if we have any other further board discussion on this item. Yes, Dr. Hadinsky.
Yeah, so I think I'm in support of the resolution. I think we have obviously a big item presented here tonight, and we haven't had a chance to talk about the financing of that. We have a finance committee meeting on Monday, and I'm the finance chair, so we're sure we'll be talking about that then. And we also have this meeting on the 17th coming up. So I'm in favor of, at this time, keeping the options open, and with the understanding that we're going to have a separate discussion on the 22nd where we can still make that final decision.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the board? Wow.
Clarification one more time. Just because on the 22nd, the board authorizes the administration to file for the exception, and the board files for the exception and is granted the exception, that does not necessarily mean that taxes will be raised by the maximum available amount. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is the decision that final decision isn't made until June, and there are lots of discussions that happen between January 22nd and June 10th. I was going to say, okay. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Okay, seeing no further discussion, I will now take a vote on the motion that's on the table. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All opposed signify by saying nay. Hearing none, motion passes 9-0.
Thank you.
All right. Now, I know on the agenda, it says that the next item will be the committee ambassador reports, but I forgot to include recognition of the acceptance of gifts after the consent agenda. So I will now turn to Vice President Teedy to accept the gifts.
And it is my pleasure to do that, and next time I'll try to jump in there. We have received a gift, and we continue to receive gifts from our very generous community. This month, we have received 3 cookbooks totaling a value of $100, donated by Michelle McMonagle to the Conestoga High School Library. We're extremely appreciative of that gift and all the gifts that we receive, and our board secretary will follow up with a note of thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Teedy, and again, thank you to all of our community who donates to the school district. We very much appreciate that. Okay, so now we will turn to our committee and ambassador reports, and we will start with policy with Ms. Susan Audrain.
Thank you, President Hadinsky. The Policy Committee has not met since the last school board meeting. The next Policy Committee meeting will be tomorrow evening, January 3rd at 7 p.m. in the district office. So come on down.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to diversity and Dr. Robert Singh.
Diversity Committee will meet for the first time in 2024 at 7 p.m. February 21st in the TAA. All are welcome.
Okay, thank you. Now we will turn to Finance, Dr. Roberta Hatinsky.
All right, thank you. We had a finance meeting on Monday, December 11th. We had our year-to-date financial reports, which we're early in the process, but overall revenues are higher than last year because of additional real estate tax and investment income. One source of revenue which continues to be lower is real estate transfer tax, which is down $400,000 from last year. We'll go over variances, in more detail as we get further down the road. State revenues are slightly higher this year, and federal revenue is lower, although the district will collect more federal revenue in later months of this fiscal year. And overall revenue is approximately $142 million this year, which is about 83.1% of the total budget up to this point. And overall general fund expenditures are about $137 million, which is 77.4% of the budget as of November 30th, 2023. And you can find all this information in the finance agendas in great detail. We had a student services update where Ms. Roy stated that student services, contracted nursing coverage, and medical supplies and equipment are so far in line with budget. We haven't received the Chester County Intermediate Unit bill yet. So we'll see what that brings in the coming months. The main item was the 2024-25 budget development and calendar. We got our first look at the 24-25 budget at the meeting, and we've already heard quite a bit about that from Mr. McDonald this evening. So far, expenses exceed revenues in that budget by approximately $11.8 million without a tax increase, and we went over the Act 1 index and exceptions as Mr. McDonald explained. We also talked about some of the projected changes in revenues and expenses that impact next year's budget under development, including increases in staffing costs and expenses related to our capital projects. We finally he emphasized that it will be reviewed further, and as he briefly touched on, we have 2 budget workshops in March and April where we do a more comprehensive look at both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. So I would invite everyone to participate in those. Those will be announced in the coming months. And we also looked at the preliminary year-end projection for this year's budget. Interest income is about $1 million higher than anticipated in the budget, and operating expenses are currently projected to be about $500,000 less than expected. So that would result in a smaller operating deficit if that continues, but we'll keep looking at that as well. The committee goals were tabled until the January 8th meeting, but I would remind committee members to think about if we need to amend those. And the next meeting will be Monday, this coming Monday, January 8th, the TEAO at 7 p.m., and we'll have another one on February 12th, and the public are welcome and encouraged to attend.
Thank you, Dr. Hatinsky. Now we will turn to facilities and back again to Dr. Robert Singh.
Thank you. The Facilities Committee did not meet in the month of December, and we will be having our meeting at 7 p.m. next Tuesday, January 9th, at the TAO. Lots to discuss. All are welcome to attend.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll turn to Education and Vice President Teedy.
Thank you. The Education Committee did meet on Thursday, December 7th, and they were updated on several very important topics. The utilization of elementary classrooms in our current schools was the first topic. The committee then turned to hearing the recommendations of the Conestoga Scheduling Committee regarding the schedule for the 2024-25 school year and some additions to the program of studies at Conestoga. To begin with, Dr. Simondera presented an update on the ways in which our current inventory of 130 elementary classrooms spread out across 5 elementary buildings is being currently utilized. Room utilization is driven by both student enrollment and special education program needs. Graphic presentations of each of the schools provided a summary of the ways that regular size classrooms and science labs are being used. And you saw one of those slides tonight in Dr. Goose's presentation. Dr. Simondera shared that if the district were to provide full-day kindergarten, 15 additional classrooms would be needed. He presented a hypothetical perfect redistricting which demonstrated that science labs would have to be used as regular classrooms rather than labs at each of the buildings in the future, even without the existence of full-day kindergarten. This would come at a time when new science standards go into effect from the state, requiring more hands-on science experiences. Dr. Simondera's complete PowerPoint is posted on the district website. It's on the quick links on the left side of the website under elementary enrollment. And I would encourage you to take a look at that. I think, though, that some of those things will also be presented again on at the special meeting, given that the enrollment and facilities use is the core of why we're talking about a new elementary school. Dr. Meisinger then shared the results of a lengthy study by the Conestoga Scheduling Committee. This group, which is made up of teachers, administrators, students, and community members, visited other high schools, conducted focus groups, thought exchanges, and surveys to study ways in which the Conestoga schedule could be modified in order to support the mental health of all the students, while also maintaining the breadth of course selection at the high school. Their recommendation, which will go into effect during the 24-25 school year, is to create what they called a mixed model. Here, students will continue the current 8-day period on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays, and have a special 4-period schedule on Wednesday and Thursday. This would allow for a lunch and learn feature 2 days a week, where students would be able to be more easily meeting with their teachers or other students, or even perhaps some clubs. It would also provide time for teachers to meet as departments regularly. The administration will be rolling out this plan in the coming months now that the program of studies, which was in tonight's consent agenda, was approved. The professional development necessary for this implementation will also be provided. Dr. Meisinger will report back to the Education Committee in December of 2024, this year. Dr. Meisinger then provided information about a new course. The program of studies, which was approved this evening, contains a course called Robotic Engineering. The one-time startup cost of this is approximately $100,000, and it will be included in the proposed budget for this year. Dr. Meisinger explained, though, that there are currently more than 100 students in the robotics club. The new space in Conestoga's addition provides the ideal place for teaching robotics, and the high student interest in the club provided the motivation to develop a robotic engineering course at Conestoga. This concludes my report for the December meeting, and our next meeting is next week, January 11th, at the Administration Building on West Valley Road at 7 o'clock, and we invite you all to attend.
Thank you, Ms. Teedy. Now we'll turn to ad hoc legislative, and Ms. Piccioni.
Thank you. The ad hoc legislative committee has not met. There are some items of note in the State House and Senate. Senate Bill 907, referred to as Armed School Security, a law requiring a school entity shall have at least one full-time armed school security personnel on duty during the school day. That has passed the State Senate, and it is now referred to the House Education Committee on December 13th. House Bill 1934, mandating cursive handwriting. That was referred to the House Education Committee on December the 28th. New laws that are now in effect. In education, teachers will be allowed to wear religious garb. School districts have more flexibility where they can have a minimum of 180 days in a school year or 900 hours at an elementary school and 990 hours at a secondary school, but not both. Low-income families will get more money through the state's Child and Dependent Care Enhanced Tax Credit. Regarding the Basic Education Funding Commission, they will issue their report on fair funding on January the 11th. There is a memo calling for House representatives to co-sponsor. It's a co-sponsorship memorandum for panic alarms in schools. Legislation would require schools to consider implementing a panic alarm system within their classrooms during the annual review of their safety and security practices, these panic alarms would be directly linked to law enforcement responders and signal a life-threatening emergency. At present, no action has been introduced, therefore no bill, a number has been assigned. I encourage our residents to do a bill search, what's called a bill search, on the website www.legis.state.pa.house, where you can navigate and search any bill either through the Senate, State Senate, or State House, and also on our legislators for Tredyffrin and Easttown Townships, Senator Carolyn Comita and State Representative Melissa Schusterman. On their website, go to their news button on their websites. It's a drop-down box. Go to Bills I Have Introduced, and it lists all their bills that they've introduced and co-sponsored. Ends my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Piccioni. Now we will turn to ad hoc public information, and Dr. Allen.
So yes, the Ad Hoc Public Information Committee has not met this year. Should a meeting be called, we will be sure to provide proper notice. Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, we'll turn to the Intermediate Unit Technical School update from Ms. Piccioni.
The Chester County Intermediate Unit has not met in December. The next meeting is January the 17th at 7:30 p.m. at the Brandywine campus on Brute Road in Downingtown. Thank you.
Okay, that includes our committee and ambassador reports. Next item on the agenda is other actions under consideration, but we have no other actions under consideration this evening. So then we will turn to item 11 on the agenda, public participation from district residents and district taxpayers regarding non-agenda matters of concern, official action, or deliberation, which are maybe before the board. This allows residents and taxpayers an opportunity to address the board on matters not included in the agenda. Same rules apply in terms of taxpayers and residents. Please state your name and township of residence at the mic. Do we have any other comments? Going once, going twice. Sold. So the public comment periods for this evening are now closed. This is the point of the meeting when we make any announcements required by the Pennsylvania Sunshine Act. Our solicitor this evening is Ken Roos, and he will make the required announcements.
Yes, the executive sessions are listed in the agenda, December 11th, December 15th, December 27th, and January 2nd, which is tonight. All four meetings, the executive session was held regarding acquisition of real estate. There were other information items shared at tonight's January 2nd meeting, but no deliberation.
Thank you, Mr. Roos. So future meetings, as we've talked about earlier today, we have a meeting Wednesday, January 17th, 2024, special board meeting, 7:30 p.m., Conestoga High School, right here. It's currently scheduled for the auditorium. Depending upon how things look, maybe we'll have it here in the cafeteria. Meetings after that, Monday, January 22nd, 2024, regular board meeting, 7:30 p.m., Conestoga High School, same location. Monday, February 26, 2024, regular board meeting, 7:30 p.m. at Conestoga High School again. And finally, Monday, March 11th, 2024, first Budget Workshop 1, 7:30 p.m. again at Conestoga High School. We have no general announcements that are in the agenda. Correspondence received by the board is listed on page 147 of the agenda, and with that, I will turn to the board and see if there are other announcements from board members. Okay, seeing none, we've come to the adjournment part of the meeting. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Ayes have it. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for attending.